I discovered my wife's affair in the most heartbreaking way possible. Instead of confronting her, I decided to disappear from her life before she even realized I knew about her betrayal. But it wasn't a rash decision. I planned everything carefully, step by step. It all started when my wife Emily decided to join a creative writing workshop. She had always been passionate about literature, and I encouraged her to pursue her interests. I wanted her to have something fulfilling, something that allowed her to express herself. Little did I know that this innocent hobby would lead to something much darker, something that would tear apart the foundation of our marriage and leave me devastated for weeks. Emily came home from the workshop full of excitement. She talked endlessly about the stories they analyzed, the writing prompts they worked on, and the new people she had met. At first I was genuinely happy for her. She seemed energized and fulfilled, and I loved seeing her so animated. It was as though she had rediscovered a part of herself. But over time things started to change. The differences were subtle at first, small but noticeable. Emily became distant both physically and emotionally. Her mood shifted. She was often lost in thought, her mind clearly elsewhere. Even when we were together, then she began spending more and more time on her phone, constantly typing away and smiling to herself as if she was sharing some private joke or secret. When I asked her who she was texting, she would brush it off, saying it was just a friend from the workshop. But there was something in her tone, something vague and detached, that made me uneasy. I tried to dismiss my suspicions, convincing myself I was overthinking it. But as time went on, her behavior grew even more suspicious. She started staying out late, claiming the workshop ran long, or that she was grabbing drinks with the group afterward. Her excuses became weaker and her late nights more frequent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening after she left for another late night, I decided to trust my instincts. I went into her office where she kept her old laptop, something she barely used now that she was always on her phone. My hands trembled as I powered it up, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me hoped I wouldn't find anything. I wanted to believe I was wrong, that I was imagining things, but deep down I already knew the truth. As I browsed through her files, I saw the usual drafts of her stories and writing assignments, but then I noticed a folder that caught my attention. It was labeled with a man's name, a name I didn't recognize. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside I found emails, text messages, and intimate conversations between Emily and a man from her workshop. These weren't innocent chats. They were filled with flirtation, secret confessions, and plans to meet in private. This wasn't just a casual fling, it was something much deeper, something that had been happening for a long time. Right under my nose, I stared at the screen in disbelief, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. My stomach churned and my chest felt like it was being crushed. The woman I loved, the woman I felt was my partner, had betrayed me completely, and I had been too blind to see it. My entire world was falling apart, but I knew I couldn't confront her, not yet. If I did, she would lie, deny it, or twist the truth. No, I needed more. I had to understand just how deep her betrayal went. That night, while Emily was still out with him, I made a decision that would change everything. I hired a private investigator, and I knew I couldn't gather all the evidence alone, and I needed solid proof before making my next move. The investigator was thorough. Over the next few weeks they followed her and collected damning evidence, photos, texts, even video footage. Emily wasn't just meeting him at her workshops, they were sneaking away during the day, meeting for lunch, booking hotel rooms together. They had Bewheel an entirely separate life, one I was completely excluded from each piece of evidence the investigator sent felt like another knife stabbing deeper into my heart. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to demand answers, but I held back. I couldn't let her see me break. Instead, I kept up the illusion that everything was normal, that I was oblivious. I played my role perfectly, all the while planning my escape. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want excuses or lies. I wanted freedom from her and the false life we had built together, a life that had turned out to be nothing more than a Sham, I had no interest in hearing her. Pleas for forgiveness. Finally the day came. I had all the proof I needed and I was ready to disappear. I called in sick at work and spent the day preparing. I packed only the essentials, making sure every financial loose end was tied up. I left nothing behind, nothing except for one thing, an envelope. The envelope was placed on the kitchen counter where she would find it the moment she walked in. Inside I included all the evidence of her affair, printed emails, photos of her with him, and receipts from their hotel meetups. I didn't write a note, not a single word. The evidence was enough to speak for itself. I didn't want a dramatic confrontation. I wanted her to come home to an empty house, to feel the weight of my absence, and to face the undeniable proof of what she had done. By the time she opened the door that evening, I was long gone. My phone was turned off, my social media accounts deleted, and I had retreated to a secluded cabin in the mountains owned by a friend. I was completely off the grid. As I sat in the stillness of the cabin, surrounded by towering trees and silence, I could almost picture the scene unfolding back home. Emily would step inside, see the empty house, and find the envelope waiting for her. I imagine her shock turning to dread as she opened it and saw her secret laid bare. Her world would crumble just as mine had. In that cabin I felt a surprising sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from forgiveness or understanding. It was a peace of knowing I had taken back control of my life. I didn't need to hear her excuses or watch her scramble for explanations. She would have to face the consequences of her actions on her own without me. Over the next few days I turned my phone on briefly, only to see dozens of missed calls and frantic text messages. Emily was begging me to come home, insisting it wasn't what it seemed. But I didn't need to read her words. I didn't need to hear her voice. The damage was done, and nothing she said could undo it. Leaving without a word turned out to be the closure I needed, but by walking away I reclaimed my life. She could never undo her betrayal, and I didn't have to stay to witness the aftermath while she was left to carry the guilt and consequences of her choices. I was free. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could finally breathe.